this would have no meaning. But rather, not only can we appreciate it and look at it from the logos function, but Colleen will help you with the eros function, the emotion piece of it, as you put together your collage.
Yes, okay. And so why collage? Why this approach? So my, to pick up where Bob was explaining his career path, I was in graduate school at the University of Minnesota, and I thought that it might be, I was there because I wanted to study creative personality and creative process. And that I thought that art could be a vehicle for doing that. And I had to argue that all the way to the dean of the graduate schools even, not just psychology. And they did not believe that this was a worthy project to take on. So fortunately, I found a wonderful man at UC Santa Cruz, Frank Barron, who had already done a lot of work about creative personality of men and women, and encouraged me to come to Santa Cruz and finish my work there, which is why Wallace and I are living in Santa Cruz now instead of Minneapolis, Minnesota. In that process, there was a lot of pushing from faculty for me to do the statistical analysis to come up with, which was going to be a killer. I knew. So, yeah, so I left with my master's. I did not finish the PhD. I got what I loved and needed very much. Then Jung came along in the, also for me in the 60s, actually, when I was still in Minneapolis. The Episcopal Church opened up the door to Carl Jung. Kudos to them for that. But that all started to come alive again for me as I pursued the personality of creative people. And who are these people? And what are their backgrounds? What are their families like? How do these creative people manage to be creative and productive? Which is a little bit of what we heard Kushbu talk about last night, the need to have a focus when you enter into your creative process. And many of you know the Myers-Briggs. And how many of you know the Myers-Briggs and know that you're an intuitive? Would you raise your hand? Okay, now just look around at how many people have got their hands up. Okay, thank you. Because only 17% of the population is intuitive. But half of this room is, and I would bet the other half of you are very close on that scale, or you wouldn't be here now. So how does the intuitive work? One of the things that the intuitive does is trust their unconscious. And we usually, up to this point for me, dreams have been the best way I've known for the individual to access the voice of their unconscious. So I wanted something more concrete. I believe that this is where the arts could do it. And so now, 1,000 collages later, I know the collage. And I know that the collage will speak the voice of your unconscious. That it's a concrete way for you to engage with the voice of your unconscious at this moment. And so that's why I'm here with you.
And to piggyback on that, what excites us about juxtaposing the fairy tale with the collage is we've created, in effect, a projective. But projectives are my unfortunate professional's identity to kind of figure out what makes a person click in a negative way. There's a lot of objections I have to my profession. And one of them was that we stand on high and we evaluate you, which I think is bullshit, regardless. So this is a projective method that excludes the stigmatization of what's wrong with you. We all have a shadow, we know that. But that's not our interest. Just like Jung's focus was on the healthy person and their development, as opposed to figuring out or evaluating or diagnosing, you know, what doesn't work so well. Go ahead.
That thing about the projective, I love that. You opened up my mind to the whole idea of what psychological testing has been up to this time. That the closest that we come to anything that's like art would be the Rorschach. And so if I put the Rorschach test up before you and ask you, what do you see here? Already you're going to be on the defensive. You can't
It's
help
an
it.
ink
You're
blot,
going to be,
is all it is.
and we're looking for what's wrong with you. That you're going to say something nasty or awful or mean. And so that, when you pointed that out to me, that doing a collage is your own picture. It's your own picture. It's not somebody else's picture against which you respond, or somebody else's list of questions about which you respond. So I love that you've pointed out that difference about it. You know, that's great.
And that's what's so exciting for us.
Yeah,
So-
and then one other thing.
Go ahead.
Is we also must pay attention to Abraham Maslow.
Yes.
Yes, because he's a forgotten psychologist, but he came up with the concept of self-actualization. And that idea, at the time that Maslow was talking about that, he guessed that maybe there would be 6 to 8% of the population that would self-actualize, because the cloud of the culture would keep that from happening on a grand scale. So, but that has changed. The human potential movement, and Maslow was the one that gave it that name. He said, and we will call it the human potential movement. And that was when things began to change for all of us, as it was when vocabulary changed.
Yeah.
And then Jung comes along and validates this unconscious and gives us all these tools with which to look at the unconscious, which is another, we'll get to that.
Yeah. So let me then, if I may,
Shall I take a seat for a moment?
yes, please. As I said before, this is the first time the Mannis aesthetic has been employed, and hopefully, because we're no spring chickens, hopefully, as this is disseminated, there will be others out there that will say, hey, maybe another fairy tale and the collage, and Colleen has a way of interpreting that will help you all understand what you've done without any worry about over-revealing or being stigmatized. The other piece I wanted to talk about is the focus here is on the rising feminine. And what this fairy tale is about the hold-fast mentality of the patriarch. And we're gonna explore how that comes undone and how it gets put back together in great, beautiful detail. But first we gotta understand that this is a prevailing attitude in society today. And because of Jung's notion that within a woman is her animus. So as we speak, please think about, for women, your animus, and for men, your anima. Because there is the stringent element to the animus is difficult to deal with. And without getting too clinical, I just, as you think about it, let's not project our animus on men, as we men don't need to project our anima onto women. So just conceptually, just be thinking about yourself as we go through, because we're all tempted to engage in holdfast attitudes, which can be quite unconscious. So anyway, that's going to be the direction. And as I said before, I'll introduce some conceptual places that take us a little deeper into the iceberg. And then we'll get down to the fun part where you get to create however you want to. And that becomes experiential, because I have felt for many, many years now that the truth resides someplace below my neck. I have been saturated with ideas and intellectual pursuits and all that stuff, and it's okay. But if I can experience it someplace in my body, for me, that's truth. It may not be your truth, that's okay. And your truth may not be my truth, and that's fine. But if you have experienced it, that's your truth. And to that, it takes us all the way back to the Gnostic tradition. And we've been talking about Christianity, and I can't think of the woman author right now, but when I read her, it'll come to me. The idea is, in the early gatherings of the Christians, there was no orthodoxy. Everybody was included. Nobody was excluded. And if you've had an experience, join us. We're not excluding you. But then the patriarchy, Elaine Pagels is her name, great work on the Gnostics. And then something in the 432, the Nicene conference, started to say, hey, wait a minute, we can draw a line in the sand here, and we can exclude some, and we can include others. And now we're off and running. But let's keep it at the experiential level for us. Rather, yes, go ahead.
What is the anima and animus?
According to Jung, the anima is Latin for soul, and it is the feminine component to a man. And the animus is the masculine of that, I guess, in Latin. And it is the masculine component to a woman. So men have inside of them a woman, and women have inside of them a man. And so it's a nice reference point, because more technically, people have looked at the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale from a masculine point of view. This is about masculine development, or from a feminine point of view. This is about a woman's development. And it's agreed. Both approaches are valid.
May I?
Yes.
I want to answer her question
Sure.
also. So how do we develop our animus as women? And it's the same for men as it is for women. It starts when you're about 9 or 10 years old, and you've been playing with the other kids in the neighborhood, and everybody's doing pretty much the same thing in terms of games and such. So you have a lot of masculine and feminine potential in you up until about that time. Girl Scouts is pretty good, I think, for that reason. But then the pressure of society begins to tell you that you're supposed to be a particular way as a girl, and you need to begin to repress that masculine business and become more feminine. And you'll get pressure from the family or sisters or good friends, or that there's a way to be a girl, a young woman, etc. In the meantime, you've had to do something with this masculine in you. And so we begin to develop an idea of it, and we carry it in us. And the idea comes from our fathers, our brothers, perhaps an uncle that you admired very much, a movie star, you begin to get an idea of what masculine would be like, or feminine for men, which is their anima. And then you go looking for some guy that is as close to this picture as you can come up with. And when you find him, and he has found you, because you happen to have his anima, kaboom! You want him. Of course you want him, because it's better to have him next to you if you can't have him at all. You know, and so then eventually Sleeping Beauty comes into the story where that's not enough anymore. And I think it's one of the wonderful things that Jung brought about marriages is that we marry this other, but then the work, capital W-O-R-K, in the marriage is to own your own masculine and for men to own their own feminine. So the wake up of Sleeping Beauty is that there's an Animus figure that she needs, wants, but she's not going to give over to it
Until he's proved himself worthy. And we'll get into all that, you know, but
Does that help with this animus, anima verbiage, language?
I think one thing you might speak to is, you mentioned projecting the anima or animus on someone else, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what that process is and why it is an entanglement.
well, because the unconscious is the unconscious, we can't know it directly. You just can't. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It means that it lays dormant or latent or unknown. But as I say to patients, be careful of chemistry. We all know the word chemistry, you know, that special feeling you get about the other person. So let's assume that for a man, the anima is asleep, dormant. And he meets women, and finally, that special woman comes along, and she awakens within, and he projects those feelings onto her. And because she has the requisite it, this comes alive, and this correspondence is falling in love. And it's very powerful. And to me, that's the essence of the projection, because we can't know it directly. We can only know it as other. So that's what the collage, in effect, will be psychologically, will be your projection as you can articulate your feelings about the fairy tale onto the collage. The pictures you choose. Oh, that one, that's perfect. No, that's not, no, I don't want that one. That doesn't work. Oh, there it is. There it is. Let's get that one.
Yeah.
That is that. I'm a big fan of Van Gogh's, and so I learned a Dutch phrase that he used. It's dat is het, means that's it. And when you see that, and that it is in there somewhere for you, that's it. And just listen to what that feels like. That's it. And now, when that occurs, now you know that you have found an aesthetic correlation or connection to yourself. And I'll just say a word about the aesthetic it. This is my book, Ars Nova, Understanding the Alchemical Mystery in the Age of Aquarius. And it's the title is rather off-putting, but hopefully it's sufficient, because when we start to follow our aesthetic, we connect with the deeper parts of ourself. And that, for both Colleen and me, is the journey. You know, when you can connect with your aesthetic, and I capitalize the I in it, because I consider myself, and we'll get into this later, a Latter-day alchemist, of which you all are too. This is not an exclusive club. This is a club for centroverts. And but how do you do that? Well, you give yourself permission. I'm looking at Sherry for aesthetic creation, and then you find, oh, that's it. Christians would capitalize the G in God. Jung said, I'm a psychologist, so I capitalize the S in self. And because I consider myself a bit of an alchemist, I capitalize the I in it. But we're all going to the same place. It doesn't matter what you call it. And it's a place of experience. So.
Yeah, it's a place of experience.
It is a place of experience, yeah. Okay, well, let's then, I want to talk a little bit about connecting with the grandmothers, which I did mention earlier, that this is, fairy tales really is the last vestige, I think, of matriarchal oral tradition. And it's, nobody tells stories anymore very much. And again, credit to John for a beautiful, the best rendition I've ever heard of Sleeping Beauty. That was inspired. Thank you, John. Now, just a word about Sleeping Beauty herself. The essence to Sleeping Beauty is the kiss. Sleeping Beauty is, that fairy tale is an evolution of the Psyche and Amor myth that goes back to at least 2,000 years. So when you're feeling this fairy tale within you, know that you're connecting with all the grandmothers through 2,000 years, and just allow yourself that awareness that you are connecting with a tradition, and specifically this fairy tale of at least 2,000 years. So, to that
I
end,
can imagine,
go ahead.
it's just a nice thought now of imagining how pleased my grandmother Kabir would be if she were looking over my shoulder while I'm making a collage.
Yeah, yeah, and thinking about a fairy tale, which is, as I keep saying,
Yeah.
very in
Which
keeping.
one did you tell me now? What was it?
So, so I'll go into a little deeper logos function, just to give you background conceptually to where we're going, and then I'll dig in. But what I want to do, before we go too much further and you get too bored with this, I want us to just break up soon and start working on our collages. And I will hold forth. I'll walk around. I'll hold forth. I'll elucidate the meaning of the symbols, because again, I'm interested in what's going on underneath the iceberg.
I'd like to just interject here too. The sense of animus, then this idea of you talking about this subject while we're doing collage. So what's happening for me personally is that a new animus has come into my life, a la Bob, just as Skip came into my life, a la Jung. At the time that I needed to take Jung in depth, you came into my life and became an animus figure for me to pursue my intellectual understanding of Carl Jung. And then you come along and you seem to have something, awareness of the magic of the collage.
Mm-hmm.
And so you pursued that. And that's the, and whatever the anima projection for you is something else, but for me, it's this need to take the collage another step. And so I went to as we were first talking about this, and you called me on the phone and said, I've just gotten off the tennis court, I'm all excited, this and da. And so I went to my Animus partner, who is standing in the back of the room, my son. But if you have a son, women, then you have got an Animus there. And I said, what do you think Bob Mannis brings to the table? Do you remember? And well, I stood just like that. And we waited a couple minutes and he said, fuel. And so this is a living example of an Animus being played out.
Thank you, Colleen,
Yeah.
very much. But remember, it's your Animus. I'm just Bob Mannis. I'm a little guy. I'm not a big guy. I'm
And
just a
you know,
little
that,
guy.
that's what happens in a relationship. Now I expect you to play this role for me. You know.
Exactly.
And that's what happens in a marriage. Then we expect this other person to carry out the role that we've projected onto them. And that's, as many of us probably know, is a disaster.
Well, Jung said he had met a woman that he had anticipated her behaviors about. Skip will know about this story, it's pretty well known. And she deviated from what he thought she should be doing or saying or whatever. I don't know who it was. Do you know who it was, Skip?
May have been Swedish Spielrein, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And anyway, so he said, well, gee, what was inside of me that expected her to behave this way when she didn't? And that's apparently how he stumbled onto the concept of the anima. And then a couple years ago, I presented to the Jung Society of DC, of which I was the founding member and last person standing, unfortunately, from that time. What I consider Jung's greatest dream, which we call the Green Dream, and if you go to my website, Ars Nova Alchemy, it'll be on there for you soon. It's not on there yet, but it will be. And so, as a result of this dream, Jung went into a quasi-psychotic, as we would say it, experience where he investigated all this, and in 1921, Skip, he reemerged. He now is ready to publish his whole thing, and that was
Symbols of, well, it was Psychology of the Unconscious, but Symbols of Transformation in German. It was later rewritten 40 years later, and so now in English it's Symbols of Transformation, but it was originally published in English in 1915 as Psychology of the Unconscious. I think that's what you're talking about. I think 21 he was publishing personality types.
Yeah, that's what I'm.
That's what you're
That's what I'm talking about. Because anyway, feel free to interrupt, ask questions, ask to go deeper on these. Let's make it a easy. Yes.
So, Colleen, when you were talking about your son being an Animus and then Bob and Skip and all, are we layering our Animus and therefore we end up expecting and projecting more and more? Or do I have kind of an assembly of Animuses in there that I'm picking and choosing? How's it work?
Well, your needs change.
Uh-huh.
Your needs change, and so an Animus projection for me and my first marriage, I recall joking about he's good stock, you know, and so the projection was to marry somebody who was going to be good stock and give me strong children, you know. So then it shifts as we go, and then becomes very romantic, and honestly, one of the first romantic Animus projections will often come not in the marriage, but after the marriage, upon a professor or a priest, art teacher, whatever it is that's not happening in your life yet. The pursuit of your spiritual life intellectually could be a projection that you fall in love with the priest. You know, so then when you know that, you know, what is it that that person is doing that I want for myself? And the way to deal with the projection is to start to develop that in yourself. So start to develop that intellectually in yourself, and you'll watch it drop away. It doesn't carry that, oh, I must divorce and marry that guy. It doesn't carry that kind of heavy punch when you begin to understand that. So then it comes along over and over in your life. And so when Wally said fuel, and I'm going to be 90 this September, yeah, you know, and I don't have it in me to take this further. And besides, it's working the way it is. It's just great the way it is. But now, something else is happening in terms of taking it to another level. Yeah.
So I think you're saying my animus is as much of a shapeshifter as I am.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Yes, good. And as you develop the skill of that animus, there'll be another one.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yes, Robin.
I just wanted to ask about, how much we have transformed or changed in terms of either or, male, female, gender being something that's, and in Jung's time it was much more, it wasn't questioned as much.
Uh-huh.
And now we see a fuller expression, someone who may present as female but have a very well-developed animus.
Yes.
And someone who may, genetically or at birth have been born male but have, and I just wondered if you had any insights on that in terms of today.
Well, I can just I'd like to hear you comment on that too, but I would, I've explored the studies of creative women quite in depth, and that development of the masculine within the woman is the key to the development of the creativity. And on the Myers-Briggs, we've been testing ourselves on the Myers-Briggs for 40 years in our group, and I have 150 Myers-Briggs profiles of women that have been doing this, and those masculine characteristics are coming in more and more. We're getting more and more integrated with our masculine.
I would argue that that's also happening with men.
Absolutely.
They are developing more of their feminine.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Could I just speak to this animus issue a little in terms of experientially? Because, let me come up in front so everybody can hear me, and also can have this a little bit. I just wanted to speak for a moment
Let's see.
about how this happened to me experientially. It's one thing to think about it in all these concepts, but and I want to relate it to Colleen also, but I think typically young men look for their mother in a partner, and men tend to look for or young women tend to look for somebody that's like their father. And so the way it happened to me is I have a photograph of my mother when she was 18 years old. I was born a year later. And the key features of that are that my mother has long brown hair and dark eyes, and obviously she was quite lovely when she was 18. And both wives that I've had, Debbie's been my wife for 36 years, but I was married for 17 years before. And both of my wives have that frame. They had Debbie had very long brown hair when I met her. And my first wife also had very long brown hair. And sort of a Judy Collins look. And in both cases, when I saw her, my Animus said, that's the woman for you, okay? And this is how people get into this honeymoon stage. They see what they're looking for. They don't know it. It's unconscious, but they see what they're looking for in this person, whoever it is. And snap, now you're chasing that. But you get married, and 8 or 10 weeks later, the honeymoon's over, right? And now you have to find out what this woman you met or married is really like. Who did you really marry? And in my case with Debbie, Debbie and I are the first couple to meet online and marry. We met online in August 22nd, 1985, about 10 years before the commercial internet. And I've made that assertion in many groups. Nobody's ever challenged me. But it was 10 years before the World Wide Web got going. And the advantage that we had was that we weren't seeing one another. I only physically saw Debbie 4 times before I left my marriage of 17 years and moved in with Debbie the same day, okay? But in that 4 months, we had no distractions, just mind-to-mind communication. And so in that 4 months, I knew Debbie better than I knew my wife of 17 years. And I knew, or my Anima knew, that is the woman for you. Okay, now, we tend to have, in the Jungian world, we talk about transferences, and we transfer our expectations onto someone else, and that's what you do in a marriage. And then you're relying on the other to be your other half.
Carry it off.
Right, and there's the famous yin-yang symbol, and that's really the way you are. You're 2 different entities, really. And I have a coffee mug at home that says, if a man speaks in the desert and no woman hears him, is he still wrong? And the answer is
And
yes.
I would say yes.
No. The answer is emphatically yes, okay, because you and your psyche are only half a person. You don't know that, but you need that other half, that split apart, that other person to bring you into life. And so if a man speaks in the desert and no woman hears him, is he still wrong? Yes, he is, emphatically. And the fact that that's a joke that everybody laughs at shows how far we have to go in our society to have understanding. Now, with Colleen and I, I'm not going to say exactly what happened, but Colleen called me on the telephone because I was running this YouTube channel about Carl Jung. And in that first conversation, which was about 20 minutes, we had a connection. Okay, and I don't want to go into the details of why we have a connection right now. You can ask us both privately. But I felt it very strongly. I think Colleen did. And so I had a transference to Colleen, which relates, it's like my mother, okay? And I'm not trying to offend Colleen in any way. I'm saying I have a transference to her as if she's my mother. And I think partially, and this is a story out of school because we've never really consciously discussed it, I think she unconsciously at least has a transference to me as a son.
I do, and it's that I know you have my back.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, and I think it's a lot deeper than that, and it's a lot tighter than that. But when Tim and I were first talking about this, what we're doing today, there was just no doubt in my mind that I had to ask Colleen whether she would join us. And as I said last night, she said, well, if you hadn't invited me, I would have been very upset. And
Which took chutzpah on my part.
absolutely,
Masculine.
absolutely,
Masculine chutzpah to
absolutely.
say that.
But it's those connections of anima and animus as we interact with people that are part of what Bob's talking about. So I'm going to shut up, but
I have a comment I'd like to make.
go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to point out that there is a shadow side to all
Yeah.
of this.
Sure.
You know, if your mother was crazy,
Right.
if your mother was weak and ineffectual, if she was controlling, all of that stuff, both men and women, it's in there. If your father was mean and an abuser, an alcoholic, or absent, that's in there. That's all part of the anima. That's all part of the animus.
And John, that shadow side will be revealed also
Yeah.
in the fairy tale, because
Yes.
there is shadow in the fairy tale. There isn't just a feel-good story. If it were just that,
Yeah,
the fairy tale wouldn't exist.
yeah.
Sure.
And our culture, again, gives
My
us all
coffee is
that
under
imagery.
your
Yeah,
chair.
That's
want it?
the work we
Yeah.
have to do. That's what we have to do.
Before you accidentally knock your chair
Well, I
off.
moved it over because I didn't want him to knock it over.
Judy, you wanted to
So,
say?
so I wanted to go back to the self-actualization. I think each of us, as we grow, and if we're really intent, we're looking at ourselves as an individual with the animus and anima. And I think if we can, and maybe you can attest, comment on this, that, we live in a world of judgment, a world of shoulds and oughts. I'm right, you're wrong. And I think that complicates our self-actualization. Is it okay that the female of the relationship takes on the role of the engineer, fixing things?
Yeah,
Is that, maybe we have to progress to that level to say that I'm an individual. It doesn't matter that I'm masculine or feminine, but in my self-actualization, I accept who I am, and I accept that I'm proficient in these activities and what I bring to whatever I do.
exactly. Yes, exactly. That I'm proficient in the activities that I'm pursuing for my self-actualization. And I can be kind in my relationships with people, but my self-actualization is what I'm here for.
And I think and don't you think we have to leave that baggage behind and move past it, and that's okay.
Yeah,
Everybody has shadow.
Yeah.
But it's just appreciating who you are and appreciating the people in your life.
yeah. It's not okay with society, but it's okay.
Well, to expand a little bit, I'd like to just very briefly, one of the things that therapeutically has helped me enormously in my work is to repudiate the judgment paradigm. There's nobody in this room is bad or wrong. Nobody. If you're here, you're not a bad person. And there is evil in this world. There's the Putins of the world, but he's just the most recent iteration. But that's not, so we don't have to, evil is readily identifiable. People that are black hearts are readily identified by us. So let's get rid of the judgment paradigm. I'm right, you're wrong, I'm good, you're bad. Or, you're right, I'm wrong, you're good, I'm bad. Let's deep six that way of thinking and go to the paradigm of understanding. Because understanding takes a lot more work, but when you do the work and you get enough data points, so to speak, to be able to appreciate the other person and understand them, it trumps judgment. All of us have had the experience of, I'm not going to judge that person because I know who they are. I know how they've arrived at that decision. So, Judy spoke to it, one of my pet peeves is judgment because it divides us. And if you internalize the judgment paradigm, you're divided within yourself. And that leads to a lot of intrapersonal problems. Addictions, any addict. I gotta stay away from Dr. Bob here, so I wanna stay on staying here, but just clinically, let's deep six the judgment paradigm for our purposes. We're all fine people here. We want to be kind, generous, and let's be that, and let's just understand each other, because that's what this is about, understanding, not judgment. So, thanks. Skip.
I'd like to just add one other thing on the gender question, okay? Because even in the Red Book, Dr. Jung was talking about being beyond gender, and he was mainly talking about people in the second half of life, about age 35, just like Mitch here. And they're right on this edge of going into, our great adventure for the future. But he talks in the Red Book about moving beyond gender, certainly at that time. And obviously gender in your early years, people establish a family and so on, and you have to do that with opposite sex people in order to have a family and build a family, and that's the sort of the Western tradition. But beyond age 35, if we stop obsessing about what our sexual equipment is and just focus on being a human being, it makes a big difference. Big difference.
Big shift.
Let me move on then, and just introduce you to the logos of our, and then maybe we can take a break and get started with the good stuff, your experience.
Good stuff.
All right, this fairy tale is beautiful from a Jungian perspective. It's got everything we could want. What we have here is we've got the masculine in two forms, the king and the prince. We have the feminine in two forms, the queen and Briar Rose. Briar Rose holds both halves of the fairy tale. In effect, she's the only one that transfers. Although the king does awaken, but he's now a tertiary figure. He's no longer central to our consideration. So we've got the queen and Briar Rose, the king and the prince. Okay? Now, in the first half, we've got the shadow. Where's John? Oh, we got the shadow here, John. The witch. And then we've got the witch. I call is the 12th, is the excluded 13th, and there's lots more good stuff to say about 13. Right, Sam? Yeah. And we have the wise woman, and they bestowed their generous gifts. Okay. And then everybody goes to sleep. And now the shift. The shift now is to the masculine, the redemptive masculine. Not the regressive masculine, but the masculine that has changed.
So, just a minute.
Sure.
So the king is very masculine and very patriarchal.
Uh-huh, yep.
He sounds like a kind king.
Yeah,
he's-
very inflated, self-righteous.
Yeah, making announcements and
Exactly.
proclamations. And then the prince is, we don't know what kind of masculine is going to be able to break this barrier.
Yes,
So there's this mystery. Yeah.
exactly,
Okay.
exactly. And so he is the redemptive, if you will, masculine, who's done the work, okay? And then we have the old man. Now, he's insidious. He's there, and he still represents the holdfast attitude of the king, in the sense that he is the good old man who warns the prince not to go for it. He says, hey, wait a minute, this is dangerous. Play it safe, buddy. You don't want to risk your life. But that's exactly what's required. But the grandfather, on the other hand, he understood that implicitly. But it was the king's decision, the prince's decision, to defy death, potential death, because he can see the dead forerunners of this effort, which in fact are his efforts previously. We call them, Neumann calls them the struggler phase of the hero. And so their previous efforts he's made to transcend and involve himself in a new consciousness. So the dead youths are his struggler phase, because he didn't just jump to being the prince. He had to earn it. He had to try, he had to fail, he had to suffer, he had to die, and he had to do it again and again and again until he had honed a consciousness that for a man is strong enough to receive the power of the feminine.
And at that point, he's not afraid.
No. And that's why magically, the roses, suddenly the transpersonal forces in the fairy tale suddenly bloom. Like, what did he do? He just made, and I have a patient who's right at that point. He's had a remarkable dream. I've worked with him for 10 years. He's a great guy. And he said, but Bob, I didn't do anything. I just changed my attitude. And I said, but you fundamentally changed your attitude. You just didn't make a nominal change because this would facilitate your growth and development. This is a wholehearted change from within, and you didn't even realize it. And so the compensatory aspect of the psyche offered this amazing dream, a white bull, this beautiful dream of the self. And so I just want to say that you don't have to do anything in the masculine sense, but the transformation has to be deep and real and genuine. And when that occurs, the transpersonal forces will reflect that by blooming and allowing you, and see what's very important in this, it was for him and him alone, because the thorns closed behind him, indicating that he himself had earned this, and it wasn't a collective accomplishment for all men, just for him. And now, with this empowered stance or ability, he could awaken the feminine within himself and connect with it in a conscious and meaningful way. And the marriage is referred to as the Hieros Gamos, H-E-I-R-O-S, capital G-A-M-O-S. It is the marriage of the sun and the moon It is the marriage of the opposites, of the yin and the yang. And so that is why, I'm getting ahead of myself, but that is why they lived happily ever after. Because they had found the balance within to sustain what was to come. And that's why it's happily ever after. Because people knock fairy tales, well, that's just a fairy tale. There's no happily ever after. If you've done the work, there is a happily ever after. And that's what we'll be reaching for.
You know it when you see it.
Yeah.
Just like you know evil when you see it.
Yeah. Yes, yes, yes.
Could you speak to why it was very interesting in this version of the story that in some ways it feels like the prince got lucky. The spell ran out its 100 years cycle, so the wounded wise woman's
Okay.
effect.
That is implicit, we've talked about synchronicity. And I am huge on synchronicity because it affirms the relationship between the ego and the unconscious. And so this is a synchronistic event, but when something of that magnitude occurs, there's synchronicity all over the place. That energy abounds. And in Ars Nova, I talk a lot more about the validation of the journey by paying attention to your synchronicity, as opposed to, well, it made me a bunch of money. I got lucky at the casino down the street. Nah, it's the inner work and the psyche's response. You see, the psyche, a lot of us have come and gone. The psyche's still there. And so, and so it has its own way of affirming our relationship to it. And I believe the affirmation occurs synchronistically. And that's another one of Jung's genius ideas or creations. I mean, without his language, we couldn't even, we would just say, well, it was a coincidence. Nah. And so, to answer your question, it was synchronicity that's happening in concert because it's in balance. That's why I do.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Unless there's another question, I'd like to point out before you
Okay.
forget that this is what our country is going through. Our country is going through this, and so the country had to go to sleep with the pandemic. And we had a rating also, who is going to lead the Republican Party? Who is going to lead the Democratic Party? We're waiting for the prince.
Or princess.
Or princess.
Or
yeah.
princess, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, yeah.
And a
And
lot of dead youths.
Yeah, and a lot of dead youth.
Yeah.
So this is what's going on with the country, which is this enormous collective unconscious that's really running this show. It's really running this show in the individual as well as in our country. And to tap into that, well, you're tapped into it anyway, we're being used all the time by it. And so to become more conscious of that and to feed into the unconscious in a healthy way.
Yeah.
To know that we're taking part in it.
So I want to just talk now very briefly about the trans.
Bob, do you want to just tear that off?
Yeah.
It's so dramatic.
Ta-da!
Let's talk about the
Just set it
trans.
down. You just set it down.
I'm sorry.
Just set it down.
Let's talk a little bit about the transpersonal personalities, okay? So, we've got the feminine and we've got the masculine, and this ties into our of the collage as well. Conscious, unconscious, rational, irrational. So you've got the feminine, you got the masculine, right? But you've got the regressive element in the fairy tale too. And you also have the progressive element. The wise women and the grandfather are the progressive aspects. And to John's point about the shadow again, the regressive element is the witch and the old man, who the prince defies. And so I just wanted to point out that on a more archetypal level, that's what you're seeing. The regressive and the progressive. You're seeing the masculine and the feminine, both in those forms. Okay? Now, last one. Then we can start to play. You can take a break and then play. I want to talk about the archetype of initiation. But I also want to talk about, or the archetype of transformation. Okay? Now, whether you know it or not, we are in the liminal space because we have been a part of the process of separation. Yesterday, we left the regular world and together now are in the temenos, the sacred space, the liminal space. So it is this archetype has three parts to it. There's the rite of separation, because the transformation can't happen in the negretto, the bump in the grind of everyday life, you know. Did you get the oil changed? Did you pay that bill? And it had to be here at 8:30. So please be aware that we have very intentionally created the rite of separation, which we effected yesterday. So for our time together, we will be in the time of transformation. And then we will have to have a ceremony at the end to prepare us to go back into the world, having experienced this time out, this time of transformation. So the archetype of transformation has three aspects. It has the rite of separation. It has the liminal rite, where cool things can happen, but it's got to be contained and it's got to be intentional. And that's what our work is going to be about today. And then when it's all said and done, we darn near got to have a rite of return, which is the rite of incorporation, to go back into the world as we know it, out of our temenos, our liminal space. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about what we're doing here.
I like that. I like that very much. It's also what we meet when we go into the liminal space.
Yes.
The shadow that John is referring to, the shadow of our country, because we'll connect into your collective, as well as the individual. And I think when talking about what the country is going through, I've been thinking, Leah, about your piece a lot. And the piece that Leah did that's in the gallery of the woman on the cross and the flag, the American flag, upside down. And that we're in this state right now. The feminine has got this state going on that is happening on a collective. And we can't help but all be affected by it. At the same time, we're talking about the feminine rising here. And we're feminine friendly.
Yes.
Put it that way. We're user friendly for the feminine. And so moving into this space is this opportunity to speak to these issues.
Just one more word about the archetype of initiation, or the archetype of transformation on a more generic level. But in the world of boys becoming men, the archetype of initiation plays a very important part, because he must think about this. All right, we're talking about standard sexual development. And Skip talked about heterosexuality and the requirement, if you want children, to be able to instinctively do that. So little girls grow up and never have to repudiate their gender identity with their first love, their mother. And there isn't, you can love your mom and identify with that gender very nicely. But for boys, he has to find a new identity. So he has to separate from that relationship to his mom. And to that end, the article I haven't written, and probably have threatened to write for 40 years, still haven't done it, is an ode to the soft male. Because I really think that in the first 6 years, right, very quickly, 4 stages of father-son relationship. 0 to 6, 6 to 12, 12 to 18, 18 to 24. The 0 to 6 stage is the one where the soft male makes it okay to be with the male, the father figure. In my case, my father was kind of a prick, and he's a difficult person to identify with. But my maternal grandfather was a sweetheart, and he and I did all kinds of things together. He was my buddy. We played together. I hung out with him a lot, and to this day, I revere him. Here's a side note. I'd like you to think about your Mount Rushmore. Who are the 4 people in your life that if you were all powerful, you would enshrine in granite? And for me, my 4 are my grandfather, Carl Jung, Hermann Hesse, and Karen Blixen, who wrote Out of Africa. Isaac Denison. Anyway, just as an aside, that's just fun to think about.
I have a
Sure.
comment or question, I don't know which. For women, we have had to sort of repudiate our grandmother's roles in the patriarchy.
Whew, boy, that's a yes. Boy, that's a hot button.
Yes.
That's the DOP. That's you can't Google it because I made it up, but I've seen it time and time again. Daughter of the patriarchy. She serves the patriarchy, and you don't mess with her. She's right. And what I free associate to what you just said is the DOP. And yes, I agree that if you have a mom or a grandmother that was a DOP, you
Or
cannot.
even previous generations.
Yeah,
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 it would be
and
Done.
they have their own struggles. But when I work with them, I just want it to be softer and more gentle and understanding and caring. It's like, no, we've got a job to do, damn it, and we're going to do it. And you put that aside because I want this done, and it will be done. And of course, I don't self-declare I'm a daughter of the patriarch, but I serve him, damn it. And there's an edge to that, and it's
So
to
does
me,
Leah's piece speak to that then?
Yes.
Yeah, the
Yes.
feminine. And so does Sleeping Beauty, by the way. I hadn't thought of that, Leah, that your piece is Sleeping Beauty. Where was Sleeping Beauty all that time? She's hanging on the cross. The feminine.
yeah.
address it, then there's the trouble. And with this interjection, not projection, but as a child, the interjection of that whole judgment system
Oh.
leads to shame.
Oh, it
And then
does.
we become shame-bound, and we start projecting out because you have to see the badness somewhere else because you feel so bad about yourself. So we have to recognize also this shame that we're carrying that doesn't allow us to feel.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And there's the judgment paradigm. I'm spot on with you. We'll get to it because there's a very neat connection between 12 and 13 I want to explore. Because 12 is a fancy word for it, is a dodecanodal number. And it means it's an even number generally associated with order and the masculine aspect of it. We have clocks that are 12. We have 12 months. And so I'll explore that with you. But the women collectively are working in tandem with each other. Because if you follow the order, the 13th comes in at the 12th spot.
That's right, yeah.
And so that gives room for the mysterious 13th to redeem the fairy tale. So there's an anansiodromia going on, where they're secretly working in a kind of tandem, because they're punishing the damn king for his arrogance, because he only set 12. If he were on top of it, and I've thought about this, if I were king, thanks, Sherry. If I were king, I would set 13 silver plates. But he doesn't know that. He's the king, so they're golden, and there are 12 of them.
And that's the way it is.
Yeah, exactly, because I'm king. So, anyway, I just wanted to, I'll get into that relationship because it's very mysterious and there's more to be said that I think you'll enjoy. But that's the relationship between the 12 and the 13. Yes?
I just can't remember. In the fairy tale, what are the women, the 13 women called? Because they're not called wise women and witches, right? They all
No.
have the same name, just one is pissed off. She's not invited.
I think they were wise women. I don't remember. John, do you remember the names of those women?
It says, and so on.
Wise women, yeah.
It gives three characteristics, and then it says, and so on.
Yes.
So-
Well, there's a problem here. This is a bit of a bitch because,
That's what I wonder, because there's, it's like, is there 12 wise women and a witch, or are there just 13 wise women? And one of them is pissed
13
off?
wise women, they can,
13 wise women, right.
Yeah.
13,
And then she's-
but she hasn't been accounted for. So if you denigrate a wise woman, then, and then she's coming. Yeah, it's a no-no, right? And so she's coming after you. Watch out.
And we still do it in our culture. There are no 13th floors, and Friday the 13th is a dangerous day. We're still rejecting her.
You're just labeling her a witch versus just the irritated wise woman on the
Yes.
chart, isn't it?
Right,
I think it's
right.
interesting, too, that they only give three. What are the three characteristics of the feminine that are described and that are invited? There's a wise woman, and then what are the other two characteristics? What I'm thinking is that only three characteristics of the feminine are described. And I've always felt that the many characteristics that the feminine and women have to offer up are not identified.
And so on.
Yeah, it's just like we're and so on. Yeah.
And as a side note, Robert Johnson wrote a great little book called She, where he explores the forerunner to the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale, the tale of Eros and Amor, or Psyche and Amor. Psyche and Amor goes by the god of love, the guy with the quiver and the arrows that if he shoots you, you're a goner. he's referred to as Eros, Cupid, or Amor, synonymous names. But, you know, Johnson made a great point in She. He said, a king's daughter is so magnificent, so unworldly, so virginal, so pure, so worshipped, but she is not courted. A king's daughter has a shadow side. She's an untouchable. Because what guy is good enough for all of that? So there's an unrequited aspect to this when you are the king's daughter. And I thought Johnson made a great point, that it's the unrequited side of perhaps a woman's personality when she is over-identified with the king's. Yes, yeah, and it's not one she wished to put herself on. So to that end, maybe she's being encumbered by something bigger than she is and requires a regressive position in sleep in order to rid herself of the problem of the pedestal, and nobody feels good enough to court her. So I just wanted to point that out as an addendum.
Colleen, in what I read,
Yeah,
the 12 were invited, the wise women, in order that they might be kind and well-disposed toward the child,
okay.
and then give good wishes.
Mhm. So they have a job to do as well,
Yeah.
you know, to be attentive to the process.
And to my way of I have two daughters, and one can throw a football with a spiral. Speaking of typical masculine and feminine, she also works for Starbucks corporate and oversees daycare centers in Guatemala for the coffee workers.
Is she a firstborn?
I'm sorry,
Is she a firstborn
second,
girl?
yes,
Uh-huh.
firstborn girl,
Firstborn girl, that's
Yeah.
it,
yeah.
that's it.
But what I wanted to say, though, is the king's hubris, the king's inflation. My daughter is so beautiful. Why not? Man, I'm lucky to have a child, a daughter. How about a little less inflation and a little more humility, because you had a hell of a time conceiving this child. Let's not own her beauty. You know, let's stay a little more humble here and grateful for a baby girl. Yes.
So that means that without the witch, the 13th wise one,
Mhm.
Sleeping Beauty or Friar Rose would have stayed in that position on the pedestal.
Absolutely. Good point. Yeah, Jessica.
Without the
12
without the
months.
intervention, yeah.
There are 12 months in a year, so that when they all go to sleep, they step outside of linear time for a moment. So that 13th thing is the
Okay.
taking you out of this.
Okay, if you can hang on just a little bit longer, I got something I want to show you.
Yeah, Judy,
So I wanted to ask, so to God, he said the 12 that invited women were asked, or specifically said, bring nice things. So it doesn't say that they couldn't have a dark side to them as well. That they were already cued in, you can come, but this is what we expect. So there, if maybe they invited 10, maybe the other 3 may have come and had something nasty
Yeah.
I think that's a good point.
to
Yes.
give.
and there's something about how we, in the women's movement, have talked about wanting a seat at the table. And then, what is it that we bring to the table when we get a seat at the table?
Yes.
And do we make enough room for everyone?
Yeah,
Because the 12 women did not say, we won't go unless the 13th can come too,
Yeah,
which is interesting.
Yeah.
very interesting.
Stand up.
Yeah,
I'm in or out, too bad.
yeah.
I've got mine.
Nine
Well,
and a
and
half
that's,
seconds.
that's truly a conflict between women sometimes. That's
Yeah.
the dark side of the shadow.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
I
Judy.
was gonna say, in the feminist movement, I learned that, Friday the 13th was an unlucky number because Friday was named after the goddess Frida.
Yeah.
And I can't remember what the 13 part was, but I have always thought of that as a power day for women, Friday the 13th, because of Frida and because it was stamped with the feminine.
Yeah.
I've had
Alright.
3 pivotal changes in my life, and they all happened on Friday the 13th.
What?
Really?
I've had 3 pivotal changes in my life, and they all happened on Friday the 13th.
As a young woman, I
Bible
had
together.
Friday the 13th, and I never considered it as bad luck again.
I've never considered bad luck either, but it is when the Templars were all burnt at the stake for the Catholic Church. Right? So
Oh,
it's kind
On
of,
Friday the
that's why Friday the 13th is important. So it's kind of like a remembrance for all the Templars who were burnt alive because they were taking the power from the church because they were the money changers. They protected people's money, you know. So that's why Friday the 13th is a big deal.
There's something about stepping outside of the boundary or the scene that's been set to have the strength and the nerve, the chutzpah again, to step out of the boundary that's been set. And in the case of the 13th, where she says, "Oh, but it's not going. everybody won't die. Everybody will just go to sleep." So
Well,
she,
that was the 12th.
the 12th
The
is said.
12th who said that.
Oh, I
Because
have to-
she had still her wish left after the witch
Yeah.
made her evil spell.
So
Okay.
she became the 13th.
Oh, I see. All right.
Well, then she became the 13th.
Yeah.
You're right.
I say, to me, the hero of the story, not that we're talking about that, but is the one who has the foresight to say, I can't change what she did, but I can alter it.
Yeah.
The hero is the, heroine is the 13th, or whatever, 12, 13, the last person does
Yes,
gift,
true.
because she has the foresight to,
Yeah.
so everything pivots on her.
Yeah, so she's become then the 13th.
Yeah.
So she was the person to give the 13th.
right. And that implies that these women know what they're doing. You know, you gotta punish the king, and yet, you know, we don't kill him, you know, we just, so let me
Offers
introduce.
redemption, she offered redemption.
Yes, yes, in the 13th role. Tim and I have talked about this.
Why punish? Why not enlighten?
Um, Because sometimes people don't get it. You can try, and you can try, and,
Where we are, where we are.
Hurt people hurt people.
why did Putin do what he did?
I wasn't one of the gifts of 13.
Let me
Why
just
was that?
talk,
I wasn't one of the gifts of 13th golden plate.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
you know, very briefly, we're talking about time beyond time in this fairy tale. You know, 100 years back in the day was probably the biggest number people could conceive of. I mean, within, you know, not very many people were educated, let alone schooled in arithmetic. So 100 years is really a symbol for that time, that gestation period. It's not, but we've become very biased with regard to chronos. Because the Greeks said there are two words for time. There's chronos and there's kairos. Now, I've been thinking about time for a while, like a lot of people do, and I get it, that if we were to make a symbol, a language for Chronos, I would do this. That's my language, that's my own, that's Chronos, okay? So when you see that, that's my new language for Chronos. And it's the only
What
way.
does that mean to you? Tell us.
Yeah, it's the only way we have of thinking of time. We think of time in a linear direction, one line.
In science, that's usually the timeline. If you have the axes, the X and the Y.
Yeah.
Time is always that axis.
Okay?
That's a very good example of the symbols that we're learning to live by. You know, of developing our understanding of the symbols. It's already in there, vis-a-vis his having chosen that line to say that. It's already there, but it isn't something that you knew intellectually. You just said, I chose to do it this way.
No, I sometimes I go down by the pond and I think, and I have a chair by the pond. And I thought of this down by my pond. So, now I've been for years familiar with the term kairos. And it usually, if you Google it or look it up, it usually means the propitious time for an event. But I always felt that was insufficient to really understand time from a different perspective. If you're just looking for the propitious time for something, find the appropriate hexagram in the I Ching. But that's one of 64 hexagrams. So I got to thinking, well, what would work for kairos? And I came up with this. That's the other one. Because this is time outside of time. This is time that returns to itself. It feels very feminine to me. And it may well be why the matriarchal tradition didn't record itself, because it cared nothing for Chronos. Think about it. Everything returns to itself. Every day returns to itself. Every month returns to itself. Every year returns to itself. And it's always a returning back to itself. So what's the point in keeping numerical notation of it when you return to itself? So this is where I think we are in the time consideration of the fairy tale. We're here in kairos. We're not here in Chronos. We're here. And we can go there much more often. And when I first started to think about it, I thought about it in terms of their antagonism to each other, this being the opposite of that. But then I thought, nah, they're really complements, depending on the way you want to look at time. And if you look at them as complementary, equal and complementary, now you've got kind of a yin and a yang when you think about time. Because you can think in the kairos tradition of this is the return, this is the start. And you see, the nice thing about the circle is no matter where you go, you're always the same. As Tim pointed out, the arc of the circle is pi. So it doesn't matter if you're here or there or here, it's always the same arc. But here, it's sequential to my way of thinking. So I just wanted to point out that I think the fairy tales, and sometimes we should think in terms of kairos, not chronos, in our own lives, because this is beyond chronological time. It doesn't deny chronology. It just offers another way to consider time, which is a lot to consider. So,
Can
yeah.
I interject something? In college, I had an East Asian religions course, and one of the first things that the professor said to us at the University of Minnesota is something you need to understand is that in the West we think of time as a river, and in the Orient we think of it as an ocean. And that is the explanation for ancestor worship. They're still with us. And I thought that was very interesting, didn't know how I could wrap my head around that. And in travels with my mom, I've been to the Orient a couple of times, and being in China, just the way that people moved about was just kind of something curious about that. And then I remembered back to that my teacher said, you know, it was almost like the population moves like an amoeba. It was like Westerners are like waiting for their turn. You know, and road rage. I didn't see anybody honking at anybody else. They were cutting each other off, but it was okay. It was okay. I just wanted to interject that as a.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. The river versus the ocean.
Yeah.
Jude.
In life, it's cyclic, but we talk about the cycle of life, the circle of life. But in the human body, you have your circulatory system, and if you don't have that complete system, it's not conducive with life. If you have a parallel circuit, you're dead within hours. If you're born with a heart defect, you're dead. You have to have that circle, that cycling blood circulation.
On one of these occasions in China, we were several of us in a van, and we drove into a large intersection, and there were many roads coming into this intersection, a dozen or so, and there's a traffic director in the middle of this with white gloves and kind of waving around, nothing being directed, just waving around. And we pull up and the van stops, and one of our astrophysicists in the group said, now, if I were to arrive here in Beijing and rent a car and come into an intersection like this, how would I know who has right of way? And the guy says, what is right of way? Just start there, and so that linear, forget it, you know?
Yeah.
It's,
I just want to make one point about kairos. Dr. Young spoke of kairos as being the right time. And so this gathering here is the right time for all of us, for example, to be here. And for all of the organizers of this event, it's the right time to be together and to do something together, let's say. But if we had met one another at a different time of our lives, we might not have been able to stand one another, or we would have been, you know, we would have been very different people at different times of our life. And so the point is that when I connected with Tim, and then we connected with all the organizers of the organization, and we set a date. Yeah, the date was Chronos, but it was the right time for all of us to pull it together. And for the kairos of everybody that came that's physically here today, it's the right time to connect with us. And, you know.
Yeah, and that's why I came to consider them complementary,
Mhm.
not oppositional. Yes.
And we could also consider that the pandemic in 2020 was a kairos.
Yes.
So they're not always great times. They are times that occur out of.
Out of time.
Not.
Yeah, right,
Absolutely.
right. Good point.
I'd also like to point out the symbol of the circle is the Japanese meditation circle. And we will be doing that, doing the Enso, E-N-S-O. And in my class, we will begin with the circle, so it ties into that time.
Good.
Yeah, yeah.
And the Native Americans say they build their teepees in a circle, and they put their village in a circle, because theirs is the same religion as the birds who build their nests in a circle.
And
Wonderful.
now we're off and running. Well, let's take a break and,
Thank you, this is marvelous, so rich.
thank you,
So
thank you very
But
much.
let's use time, because we can. What time is it now? And what time will we get back?
It's 11:15.
It's what, 20 of 11?
Yeah.
20 of 11. So let's get back at 10 of 11, and is 10 minutes enough? 10 minutes of 11.
But first of all, before we move, I want to introduce Bercy. Can you step up here?
Hold on. Wait, yeah, attention.
Attention!
Bercy is from Ethiopia. She is a student here at Carroll. She came last August, and within a few weeks of her arrival here, her part of the country dissolved into civil war. And for months, she didn't know whether her family was still alive. And tomorrow morning, I think 10:30, she's going to tell her story.
Oh.
So everybody gets one of these. It's full of gifts from the organizers. So this is for you.
Thank you. Very nice to meet you.
Oh, okay.
And for everybody on the live feed, we're going to be back in 10 minutes. So we'll cut off and see you back here in a minute.
So should we take a break?